So I will go ahead and yeah, introduce Jon Clindaniel from the University of Chicago. So he is a professor in the computational social science program there and is a computational anthropologist. And his work is actually focused on using solving difficult archaeological problems using data science techniques. And this is a field which is really growing quickly. And indeed, I'm in a linguistics department, and I know that computational linguistics just in the last 5 years has really exploded in some of the sophistication of the techniques that can be used to decipher languages and do automatic grammatical analysis and things like that. So he actually is systematically deciphering several symbols from the Inka Khipu sign system. And that was his PhD dissertation at Harvard in 2019. So these are tied chords with knots in them. And the Khipus are said to have recorded everything from accounting records to literature. They're the primary sources for Inca culture from within the culture themselves. And so obviously would be really key, essential for understanding Inca representations of themselves prior to Spanish conquest. However, the Khipu signs have not been well understood or well deciphered. The numerical system was figured out back in the 1920s, but since then, very little's been done. And so we've relied almost entirely on the accounts of Spanish chronicles to understand the Inca past. And so Jon's work is allowing us to further decipher some of these Khipu signs and get an internal Inca perspective on their own past. So Jon, welcome. And the talk today will be interpreting the political dynamics of Inca Khipu sign production.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. I believe I'm now sharing my screen and ready to go. So here, let me. Move this a bit. Okay. Yeah, so thank you for inviting me to speak with you all today. And thank you as well to everybody on the panel for the fantastic presentations thus far. I've learned so much being here, and I've been taking quite a few notes. And I'm definitely going to follow up on a lot of these concepts in my own work. So let's transition over to the Andes in South America and talk about Inka Khipus. For those of you who perhaps have never seen one, Khipus do look a bit different than the writing that we're used to seeing, and quite a bit different than the scripts that we've seen thus far in the symposium. Instead of inscribed characters, the signs of a Khipu are composed of knots, chords, and colors, like you see right here. They're also largely still undeciphered, but Khipu scholars have made quite a bit of progress in recent years, and I'm going to share some of that with you in a little bit. First, though, I'm going to provide a little bit of background to hopefully get us all up to speed on what exactly Khipus are and what they were used for by the Inca. So for those of you who might not be that fresh on your Andean history, the Inca called their own empire Suyu, which in the indigenous language of the region, Quechua, just means the four parts intimately bound together. And you can see in the diagram here that there are in fact four parts, four major regions radiating out of the capital city of the Inca Empire, Cusco. And the Inca Empire is actually relatively late in terms of the history of all of the civilizations we've been talking about thus far in this conference. So we're talking about 14th and 15th, 16th centuries AD, CE, and not BCE. But it seems like, at least in the Andes, this is the first major conventionalized system that we can begin to call writing. You can see, though, that the Inca Empire was enormous. It extended all the way from modern-day Colombia, all the way down through Chile and a tiny little bit of Argentina to the south. And just for sake of comparison, This is around the size of the Western Roman Empire at its height, with intense bureaucratic control of its territory, its people, and all the products that were produced within it. So each one of these major suyus was split up into provinces, which you can see here reconstructed on the right. And all of these provinces, all of these suyus, would have been tracked using quipus. Below the suyus themselves, for instance, we know that the Inca state kept track of people even down to the local level. So at the very top of this decimal organization, the Inca administered their suyus, then their provinces, then they had administrative centers that administered 10,000 households at a given time, all the way down to 10-person units within this entire enormous empire. They needed to tax people and kind of keep track of what they had available to them in the empire. One important note, though, that we'll return to in a bit is that they taxed people not through money, but through labor. So they sent individual people from one side of the empire to another to do all sorts of various tasks like military service and agricultural work and mining and much more. And beyond the labor itself, the state also had to keep track of the products produced through this labor. And again, they did so, we think, on quipus. And this allowed them to effectively redistribute goods throughout the empire. And we know that they moved some items thousands of miles along their extraordinary road system that ran all throughout the Andes at the height of the empire. So this seems like a logistical nightmare to be so intimately aware of everyone in the empire. But by all accounts, the Inca were able to keep track of this information through quipus. So we also know that the Inca produced demographic texts that effectively help them draw labor tribute. So we have census quipus. And we also know that the Inca recorded ritual and agricultural calendar informations on quipus to keep track of both labor commitments to the gods and labor commitments to the Inca state as well. And then finally, one final example I'll bring up is that the Inca are known to have kept historical chronicles of their past rulers on quipus, describing them and describing their conquests and the typical chronicle kind of format. And we do have Spanish and Quechua transcriptions of many of these chronicles that are said to have come from quipus. Unfortunately, at this point, we have yet to find or identify at least a quipu that matches as a historical narrative. To perform all of these functions, Spanish chroniclers like Marua tell us that trained quipu specialists called quipu Kumayuks spent 4 years in the capital city of Cusco learning the conventions of the quipus, how to interpret them and how to make them. And you can imagine something like this would be necessary to be able to communicate across such a large empire and have different quipu Kumayuks in one part of the empire understand the signs of a quipu Kumayuk in another side of the empire. And basically, you can think about this as a university program with a quipu major in Cusco. And in my research, I've done a series of computational studies of all known and digitized Inca quipus that actually reinforce this notion of a highly conventionalized system of signs sponsored by the Inca state. You'll see, though, over the course of this talk that there is no evidence of phonetic sign meanings at the time of the Inca Empire. So we need to use the term writing in kind of a loose sense to describe quipus. It's definitely a non-glottographic writing system. What I'd like to emphasize in this talk, though, is that this conventionality wasn't so much an evolutionary stage that the Inca achieved, and that suddenly all Inka Khipu making magically conformed to. Conventionalized Khipu sign production was more of an ongoing dynamic political process. And we have evidence of alternative local semiotic codes operating at the same time as this imperial code that was all-encompassing. So I suspect this was common in both glottographic and non-glottographic writing systems, and especially in the early stages of their institution and maintenance, like we have the ability to witness in the Khipu system. Before we dive too deep into the weeds, though, let me give you an introduction to the features of the Khipu so that we can at least be on the same page and share a common vocabulary as to what we're talking about. Khipus across the empire had a common physical form. So you can see here, they had a primary cord on which were attached a series of pendant cords, which could be plied in different directions, would have knots tied to them, it could be different colors and so on. And then attached to these pendant cords, you could attach further subsidiary cords, which could have further subsidiary cords attached to them. So it can get very complicated very fast, but in general, this is how the Inka Khipus are structured. And they're believed to have been read from the end knot towards the dangling end. So you read this cord first, and you read this cord last. And throughout the empire, all the way from northern Peru down through Chile, these features are remarkably durable. So it does seem that at least the physical features of the Inka Khipus are remarkably consistent. Beyond the physical structure of Khipus, Leland Locke demonstrated in the 1920s that numbers worked in this particular way for the vast majority of Khipus in the Inca Empire. So specifically, they seem to record numbers in a base 10 system like ours. Conveniently, the Quechua language is base 10, and it seems like the knots on these Khipus were arranged in the same way. And functionally, for us, how we can view this is basically just our number system, our base 10 number system, flipped vertically. So to represent the number 102 on a Khipu, I tie a number in the 100s place on the Khipu. I leave the tens place on the Khipu blank, and I tie a number 2 in the ones place to represent that I want to designate the number 102. If I wanted to write the number 113, I put 1 knot in the hundreds place, 1 knot in the tens place, and then a special knot to designate 3 in the ones place. And this is the number 113. And one thing to note that will be important as we go further along in the talk is that the knots they used in different positions are actually different knots. So the knots in the tens and higher places are just a simple overhand knot. And in the ones and digits places, they used 2 special knots. This figure 8 knot, which was used to designate the number 1 and only the number 1. And this knot we call long knot, which was used to designate the numbers 2 through 9 and only the numbers 2 through 9. So I apologize at this point. Normally, if I was in a classroom, I would have some rope for you all and we could practice tying some of these knots. It definitely makes a lot more sense to think of these in tactile terms. I'll leave that as an activity for you later if you are so interested in learning more about this system. I do have a series of YouTube videos out there that show you how to tie all these knots. So up to this point, we know how to read numbers on quipus, and as a result, it's attracted a lot of very mathematically inclined people to quipu studies because we just have a series of numbers, and no one's been able to demonstrate how the corresponding non-numerical signs would have worked. We have numbers, but none of their labels, making it virtually impossible to interpret the full range of genres we're told that these quipus recorded. So for instance, here we have the numbers 102 and 113, but nothing about the dynastic succession of Inca rulers in the historical chronicles that were promised in the Spanish chronicles. So how did the Inca represent such non-numerical information on their quipus? And do we have any hope of being able to actually read these? In one of the more influential theories, Gary Urton has argued that the physical features of Inca quipus are inherently binary. So you can twist a cord one way or the other, and only one way or the other. You can tie a knot in only two directions. And we'll explore these options in a bit more detail in a bit, but just know that basically the construction features, the physical construction features of these quipus are inherently binary. So Urton argues that the signification system would also need to play off of these binary characteristics. So he suggests that information was encoded using what they call in linguistics marked and unmarked pairs. So in a pair of one marked and one unmarked sign, the unmarked sign is typically said to be inclusive of and potentially hierarchically superior in a social sense to the marked term. So think the word day in English as the universal word for both a 24-hour day and daylight hours in particular. Day is an unmarked term. It's more inclusive. It includes the whole 24-hour day. Versus compare this with the term night, which is a marked term. This is more exclusive. It's specific to nighttime hours. And these kinds of binary oppositions made their way into many different arenas in traditional Andean culture. So it would make sense for them to have represented things in this binary dualistic kind of way. So just as one example, I could give many more, the Inca spatially divided their capital city of Cusco into upper and lower parts. Which were called Hanan and Huran. And the upper part of Cusco received ritual priority over the lower and was said to kind of encompass and include that lower part. So it would make perfect sense for quipus to represent information also in this way, to represent these dualistic concepts that are constant within the Inca world and the broader Andean cultural world. With this in mind, Frank Solomon, another quipu scholar, has argued that such signs might have been used as sort of predicates to numerical values, something like how a pie chart works in a modern infographic. So for instance, here we have a budget pie chart that denotes categories using both color and the size of the circular segment to show us the relative comparison of each number to other numerical values. So we could potentially think about chord colors in the exact same way. Maybe the color of a chord somehow denotes something about the numerical value that's being recorded. And we would expect this to happen, according to Urton's theory, in kind of a marked, unmarked type of way. So in terms of dualistic categories, as opposed to kind of general categories. And for a number of years, these were really interesting theoretical frameworks for thinking about quipus, but they didn't really advance beyond that. We had no empirical evidence either in post-conquest quipus or in Inca quipus that they actually worked in this way, that the non-numerical signs actually functioned in unmarked marked pairs, or that they worked in this infographic type of way. In the past 5 years or so, though, there has been kind of a flurry of post-conquest quipu studies that have demonstrated that at least isolated quipus in the highlands of Peru actually did represent information in this. So I'm going to show you a few of these just to give you a sense of how these non-numerical signs would have worked in the post-conquest world, and then we'll transition into how that can help us understand the Inca world as well. So first of all, quipu cords are always made by bringing two threads together and then plying them, which basically means just twisting the multiple cords together. And you can either twist two cords together in this S direction or this Z direction. And the only reason they're labeled S and Z is because they're meant to denote the central axis of the plied cord. So you'll notice S has a central axis that goes from the top left to the lower right, just as this cord has a central axis that goes from the top left to the lower right. This is not an Andean concept. This is a quipu scholar's concept. But ply can be represented, or it can be plied, cords can be plied in either an S direction or in a Z direction. And Sabine Hyland, another major quipu scholar, actually found a herder's quipu in 2014, along with a transcript recording what each sign on the quipu meant. And this quipu is from the 1890s, so it's relatively late, and up to this day, quipus continue to be used in limited contexts like this. And what she found is that the ply direction on this quipu actually used, or rather these cords used ply direction as a means to distinguish male versus female sheep, as well as the milking status of cows. So you'll notice that from here that a quipu can be plied in either an S or a Z direction. And in this case, S-ply cords were used to represent an unmarked category, which is females in this case, because they can reproduce, and they're thus inclusive of the larger category as a whole, as opposed to Z-ply cords, which signified the marked category, which were the male animals who couldn't reproduce and couldn't bear milk. Additionally, in another study, Sabine Hyland also found that knot direction played a role in post-conquest Catholic quipu board technologies. So these are basically just giant alphabetic boards that have cords inside of them. And what she found was that the knot direction tied to the boards corresponded to the moiety, or the social group, to which individuals in the quipu board were associated. So in Andean communities, just like in Cusco, you had these upper and lower portions in social groups, and these were being designated on this quipu board technology via S and Z knots. So you'll notice here we also use the S and Z terminology for the central axis of the knot being an S or a Z. And as you can see from this diagram, all of the Inca quipu knot types that I was describing before, the single knots, the long knots, and the figures, can all be tied in these two directions. So the Inca theoretically also could have been using these unmarked and marked social groupings. Similarly, Gary Urden and Manny Medrano found relatively recently that in the 17th century, in the Santa Valley of Peru, attachment type, so the way in which a given pendant cord was attached to the primary cord, actually was another way of representing information. So you can either attach a cord from the back or from the front, which produces this kind of a look or this kind of a look, depending on which side of the quipu you're looking at. So what they found is that these recto and verso designations actually also indicated moiety affiliation, one being the upper social group in the community and one being the lower social group in the community. And these kinds of quipu, or these kinds of attachments, are also identical to what you find in Inca quipus. So it's possible that in the future we'll be able to find Inca quipus that also proceed in this particular way. And then finally, one last post-conquest example I'll walk through is another of Sabine Hyland's studies, where she demonstrated that in a post-conquest, early 20th century set of labor quipus in the town of Anchucaya, which is this town up in the highlands of Peru, she found that the quipus there that they were using used two distinct color patterns to distinguish the quipus as a whole as quipus that recorded aggregate level labor statistics and quipus that recorded individual level labor statistics. So the two color patterns that she found were color seriated quipus, which have one color followed by another color, followed by another color, followed by another color. And then you repeat this sequence of colors again and again and again over the quipu. The other color pattern that she found was this color banding pattern, where you have one color, 4 chords or however many chords you want of the same color, followed by a different color and multiple chords of that color, and then different color, different color. And what she found in Anchucaya was that seriated quipus were being used for aggregate level labor statistics, and color banding quipus were being used for individual level labor statistics. So practically, what this means is that each chord in the banded quipu actually referred to an individual person within the village, and the color referred to the task that they were assigned to do within the village. So some sort of community labor, like cleaning the plaza, or whatever sorts of festival activities that they were required to do as a household. And then the knots tied to each chord would tell us basically how much labor they actually did towards that particular task. Each chord in the seriated quipu would then be an aggregate of these banded chords. So this, these 4 chords would be added together and would be represented as a sum here on this blue chord. These 4 green chords would be added together and then form a sum here on this green chord, and then so on. And then these further sets of seriated chord groupings would then have been used for representing either future cycles. So perhaps this is this year's data and this is next year's data. Or it could also be used for different subgroups within a village. So if this is one banded quipu, one subset of the community, this might be represented in this particular subset, and then another banded quipu might be added together and aggregated in this set. So in this case, color seriation occurs as the kind of the unmarked category. It's inclusive of the banding, the banded Khipus. And the banding here is a marked category at the Khipu level of signs. So the Khipu level, at the Khipu level, we can see that this Khipu refers to aggregate level data, labor data in particular. And this Khipu refers to individual level Khipu data. To recap, we have evidence that at least in post-conquest times, Ply Direction was a category that was used to represent marked and unmarked categorical data. Not direction was also used for marked and unmarked data. Attachment type used for the same thing, and then also color banding and seriation. One thing to note, though, is that each one of these identified instances exists within a very limited context of interpretability, either on the community level or even a single Khipu level. This is not a, none of these signs are Andes-wide sign conventions. These are specific to a certain community or a certain Khipu Kamayuk. So my PhD dissertation, which I'm now turning into a book, focused on first answering whether these same types of marked, unmarked signs were used in Inka Khipus, and if so, at what scale these types of signs were conventionalized and produced. After all, decipherment of a single Khipu Kamayuk's code is very different than a broad-scale decipherment of Inka Khipus across a geographic region. Or Khipus across a particular genre. So it's still an empirical question whether Inka Khipus had broadly conventionalized signs, where a Khipu Kamayuk on one side of the empire could actually read the Khipu of another one on the other side of the empire. Unfortunately, both of these questions are a bit of a challenge to answer, since we have no Rosetta Stone to compare an Inka Khipu with at this point. Nor nice transcriptions like have been found for post-conquest Khipus. Nonetheless, I think that a certain type of decipherment is still possible for the Inka Khipus on the basis of these post-conquest finds, excavation, as well as comparison with other Andean semiotic media. What this practically means for me is that I, as a computational archaeologist, spend a lot of my time with these windows open on my computer, digitizing Khipu data and writing code in Python. I run an open source project, the Khipu Lab, that aggregates all known Khipu data from all of the major published sources. And my students and I write open source software that can be used to search these Khipus for broad scale patterns and conventional consistencies. There are currently around 1,000 digitized Inka Khipus from across the Inca Empire, which I look for regular patterns in and can identify when post-conquest Khipu sign vehicles are also used by the Inca in ways that are consistent with the marked and unmarked type of strategy that I've been talking about so far. As I noted, I'm interested in whether these practices, though, are highly localized, or if we can talk about the quote-unquote Inka Khipu as a single coherent code. This is an enormous data set by archaeological standards. So over 50,000 chords are currently included in the data set, and 100,000 knots. I know whenever I give a version of this talk for astrophysicists, they kind of roll their eyes at that data because it's nothing and by their terms, but for an archaeologist, that's a lot. And if we can't find evidence of shared standards using this collection, they're probably not there. One of the things I've investigated computationally is knot direction. So we talked about this a little bit before in relation to one of Highland's studies. And we know that in isolated Khipus in post-conquest times, people did use knot directions to indicate marked and unmarked sign relations. How about in Inca times? This argument is a little bit more detailed than I have time to go through right now, but I'll present to you a kind of idealized diagram of the general pattern that we find. So you'll remember that long knots and figure-8 knots are only used in the bottom position, so the ones position on quipus, and single knots are only used in the tens and higher position. The interesting thing that we find is that almost universally, figure-8 knots and long knots, when they're alone on a chord, are tied in the S direction. When they occur alongside a single knot, either in the tens, hundreds, thousands, whatever position, they are tied in either an S or a Z direction. However, it's virtually equal, the number of times they're tied in the S and the Z direction. In the tens and higher position, though, single knots are almost universally tied in the Z direction. You never find them almost in the S direction. So what I think is interesting here is this perfectly mirrors a marked unmarked relationship that we would expect to see, where the lower value knots, these figure-8 knots and long knots, only occur in this S position on their own, so they're marked as S. But then when they come into to contact with a marked or an unmarked term, like these in the higher positions, the tens, hundreds, thousands, they can either be an S or a Z. So they can be incorporated, they can be included within the scope of the unmarked term. And this is very much what we would expect with marked and unmarked terms. And in fact, you see that overall Z knots appear a lot more than S knots. But where the S knots do occur, they occur in this very limited scope. So I would claim that these lower knots are, these S knots are marked in comparison to these single knots in the tens and higher places that are unmarked. And one interpretation I think is likely here comes from Quechua numeration. In Quechua, compound numbers are conceived in terms of possession. So we have the phrase chunka kinsayuk, which just means 10, possessor of 3. And this is the way that compound numbers in general are represented. And given this grammatical structure, it makes perfect sense why such a phrase could be represented using knots in this marked and unmarked notation. It's essentially just a replication of Quechua numerical grammar, where the tens place and higher can be represented as an unmarked sign, so inclusive of the marked sign below it. So we have the 10 represented as a unmarked sign. It's inclusive of the 3, which is the mark sign, would be denoted with an S naught. So this seems to have been a fairly standard feature for recording numerical data throughout the Inca Empire. There seems to at least have been a correlation in meaning between the Quechua numerical grammar and the knot directions that were being used. But remember that I said this Khipu conventionalization seems to have been a dynamic process. While almost all of the quipus that are digitized follow this pattern, at a single site, the entire 14 quipu archive systematically does the opposite. In fact, you have S knots everywhere within the corpus. And here, the marked category that occurs in the rest of the quipus throughout the empire is being used in the tens place and higher. You have figure 8 knots and long knots being tied in the Z direction, alone on a cord. So it seems like all of the patterns that I identified for the empire as a whole no longer hold at Armatambo. But this is a set of 14 quipus out of 1,000. So it's kind of an odd divergence. So why do I think this is? One interesting thing to note is that Armatambo was actually transformed during Inca times from an important rival Ichma site into a major 10,000 person level Inca administrative center. So this is very much an Inca administrative center in kind of indigenous land. And one possible reason for the Armatambo archive's divergence from the rest of the known quipus may lie in the fact that the quipus at Armatambo were found in a local indigenous style funerary context. While they were found in an Inca phase, the excavators note that the quipus were associated with grave goods that had more local indigenous parallels than they would expect for an Inca bureaucrat from Cusco. Given the context of these quipus, it seems plausible that they just were not under the same imperial oversight as the rest of the Inca quipus that we may have recorded. Everything else about these quipus seems similar to the normal Inca quipu standard, but there's this innovation, we can potentially call it, in knot direction signs alone on these quipus, perhaps an alternative code meaning something different than the standard code. So this doesn't seem to invalidate the convention overall, but we can see hints that outside of the official bureaucratic context of the Inca state, the conventions were not totalizing. The context in which quipus were found is essential for understanding what they mean, whether they're adhering to an empire-wide convention or some local innovative way of using quipus. So at the very least, it seems that we should expect tighter adherence to Inca codes and clearer conventionalization in Inca imperial contexts, as well as areas under direct Inca control than in contexts like this indigenous funerary context. So what is the difference than being on the ground at a directly controlled Inca imperial context like I'm talking about? How exactly would the Inca have enforced their code at their far-flung regional centers? In 2016, I had the opportunity to excavate at the Inca military garrison site of Inkawasi, a site that we might expect to fit the bill as being under direct Inca control. It's a military garrison site. It is, however, a ways away from the capital city of Cusco and was only conquered later in the empire's history. The reason I went there is that a couple of years prior to me going there, the Peruvian archaeologist Alejandro Chu and his team had excavated 34 quipus in situ a couple of years prior. During the time I was there, we moved excavation to a series of colcas, which are just Andean silos for grain and all sorts of other things. And within these colcas, within these silos, we found additional quipus, 23 in total, that were all at the base of these colcas, presumably recording the things that were in the silos. And the interesting thing, though, is we found these quipus alongside the raw materials and the semiotic tools that quipu Kamayuks would have used to actually produce the quipus. And as you can imagine, this was a huge boon for understanding conventionalized sign production at the site and probably elsewhere as well. So to quickly sum up what we found a bunch of these bundles. You can see that here there's kind of a mess of chords. This is not a Khipu, actually. This is a series of pre-made Khipu chords that could have been attached to a Khipu. And then you have raw fiber and that could have been spun and plied on the spot. And then a series of these sticks, which cleaned up, you can see right here, have a series of colors tied around them as string. And what these wrap sticks seem to have been used for were as a code for producing chord color combinations in the Inkawasi Khipus. So an individual chord can be a solid color or can be multicolored, depending on whether you ply 2 chords of the same color or 2 chords of a different color. What I found with these wrapped sticks is that adjacent colors on here, so let's say yellow and green, account for nearly half of all of the chord color combinations across the site, and 4 of the top 5 combinations at the site, which is statistically very improbable. So it seems that the color signs at the site were conventionalized according to the color pairings on these wrapped sticks, which I'll argue in a second are also marked, unmarked pairs. And these adjacent colors also account for 5 of the top 10 color combinations across all known Khipus in the Andes, which is pretty amazing if you remember that we only excavated a few of these wrap sticks. One interesting side note is that sticks like these are called musawaranya in the Andean weaving community. So weavers will actually use these sticks to this day as kind of a code for warping their loom with the proper sequence of colors for warp-faced weaves. And the technique here seems to have been adapted by the Inca state for producing Khipu chords in the correct way as well. So this is a hint that at the Inca facility, they do seem to have had a method of enforcing a specific code with relation to colors. And no doubt they had similar methods for other signs like knot direction as well. But what do the adjacent colors actually mean? So these adjacent colors in the wrap sticks seem to have been used to designate families of dualistic meanings, marked and unmarked terms. Here, I'll describe it in a bit more detail in a sec. You have addition, subtraction, and the combination of the two. And in Andean textiles, light and dark colors are often associated as being marked and unmarked categories. So you think about a light color as being a male and a dark color as being a female. And when you combine those colors together, you can think of the color combination as being a child of the male and the female, sharing characteristics of each of the colors that have been put together. And here it seems that they were doing much of the same thing. So we have light and dark color pairings, probably coded from wrap sticks. So all of these colors on here, these color combinations are from wrap sticks. And they were used to conventionalize these colors. So what seems to be happening here is you can see that if you just take a look at the numbers, you have 90 minus 15 equals 75. 99 minus 15 equals 84. 95 minus 15 equals 80. And what seems to have been denoted with these colors is the actual arithmetic operation, the actual arithmetic action. So we have a positive number here, positive 90. And this is denoted with the light color. This is the unmarked color, if you will. Then we have the subtractive operation, designated with the dark color. So we have 90 minus 15, and there's a color combination chord, so light and dark colors, which denotes the equality, the result, the combination of the light and the dark colors in the dualism. So just as a side note, if the Inca represented addition, subtraction, and equality in this way, you can also imagine they could represent other actions in the same way. So to give and to take, to fight and to protect, and other sorts of dualisms that are built within the Andean poetic universe. So I suspect the next frontier of decipherment is really going to be finding these dualisms and finding how they can combine in color combination chord. I should note that some other quipus at Inkawasi use the color amber brown, so this color here, and medium brown to designate these addition and subtraction operations. And what seems to be happening here is basically the color shade of the quipu shifted darker. So this amber brown, medium brown color combination is also included on the wrap sticks right next to the white amber brown combination. And you can see that what this seems to have designated is a different order of operations. So instead of having 90 minus 15 equals 75, on this quipu, which is identical to the other one, just with its numbers reversed, we're getting the net debit as opposed to the net credit. So let's say this is a tax. We're getting the tax amount as our final number here, as opposed to the net amount that we have. So instead of 90 minus 15 equals 75, we have 90 minus 75 equals 15, sort of a double entry bookkeeping, if you will. And here again, we have the lighter color as an additive operation, the darker color as a subtractive operation, and the combination of the two as the equality. Of course, it seems like the color gradient here between quipus is also important. So the lighter of the quipus is a net credit quipu, resulting in these larger numbers after tax, potentially. And the darker quipu overall is a net debit quipu, very consistent with this notion of subtraction versus addition. And moving on, you might recall that Sabine Hyland also demonstrated that post-conquest labor quipus in Anchukaya used two distinct color patterns to distinguish between kin-based group-level labor statistics, which I called the unmarked category, and individual-level labor statistics with banded quipus. And given their penchant for bureaucracy, it also seems possible that this pattern might also hold for aggregate level statistics and individual level labor data in Inka quipus. So we can actually model this using this large quipu data set. And here what I've done is modeled aggregation level of a quipu using this metric that I call quipu magnitude. Which is just a fancy name for the largest number on a quipu. So if a quipu, the biggest number on the quipu is 100, the quipu magnitude is 100. And what I did was I fit a logistic regression model to assess the probability of a given quipu being seriated or banded given this magnitude that's on the quipu. And something interesting emerges when you fit this model. You can see that the probability of a quipu being banded is very high at the low quipu magnitudes. And the probability of a quipu being seriated gets very high after around 100 in the Khipu magnitude scale. So why is this? If you recall the Inca decimal organization that I mentioned at the very start of this talk, you recognize that this coincides with the Pachaka level grouping, which is the 100-person administrative unit of Pachaka. And within the Inca Empire, this was actually considered a fundamental aggregate, below which is kind of the level of the village. So individual level kinds of recording. And above that is like serious administrative centers of 1,000 and 10,000. So we can actually see that lower level administrative groupings seem to perfectly correspond in the between the Inca Empire and the actual numbers we see on these quipus with banded quipus, versus higher level numbers seem to correspond with seriated quipus. So given what we can see here, it seems like there is in fact a correspondence between aggregation level on the quipu as a whole and this color pattern, similar to what Highland found. And you can see that the spatial locations that these quipus are coming from are from all over the map, from all over the former Inca Empire. They're heavily located on the coasts because that's where we find most of our quipus. It's very dry on the coast, and that's pretty much the only location that archaeologists can find fiber in the Andes. But if you run the same model with latitude and longitude incorporated into it, seriation and banding probability remains the exact same. The model remains the same. There is one wrinkle though, there's an outlier. The 10 quipus that appear in Chile do not obey these rules at all. They have extremely large numbers on banded quipus. And their seriated quipus are a little odd. So they're behaving nothing like what we would expect banded quipus and seriated quipus to behave like. And the interesting thing here is this corresponds with the Inca administrative district of Colesuyu. And Colesuyu was even a bit of an aberration for the Inca. So I mentioned at the outset that the Inca called their own empire Tawantinsuyu, or the four parts together in Quechua, where each part of the empire was called a suyu. And they saw their empire as being composed of these four suyus radiating out from the capital city of Cusco. There was Kuntisuyu, Chinchaysuyu, Antisuyu, and Coyasuyu. You'll notice I did not mention Colesuyu. The term Colesuyu actually seems to have come from an indigenous non-Inca geographical concept used to describe the region that is now northern Chile. And it was kind of awkwardly imposed upon the standard Inca quadripartite division of space as a later effort to incorporate it within the empire. In addition to this conceptual divergence from the standard Inca terminology, the archaeology of Colesuyu indicates pretty mixed Inca control of the region, with only some locales being tightly controlled by the Inca and others left to local control. Despite Inca supervision, for instance, there is evidence of several distinct local ethnic groups pursuing their own economic modes. So some are fishing, some are cultivating agriculture, and this kind of autonomy is not what we would expect from the Inca in general. And it seems that because of the patchwork of geopolitical identities in this region, the Inca didn't even really possess or even pursue hegemonic control over this Colesuyu region. Although they did post way stations along the roads here, and they did have Khipu Kamayuks operating in this region and reporting back to the state. As a result, though, in other areas of life, including Khipu record keeping, local codes proliferated over the standardized codes of the Inca Empire. So we can just briefly contrast the situation in Colesuyu with the situation pertaining to the Khipus found at Inkawasi, which I talked about a bit earlier. You'll remember that Inkawasi was this Inca-run military garrison on the southern coast of Peru, which would have been closely overseen by administrators from the capital. Furthermore, Inkawasi was explicitly designed by the Inca to be an architectural manifestation of the capital city of Cusco. And as both an Inca-run military garrison and this physical manifestation of the center of the empire, we should expect that the conventions would have been reproduced according to the standard state semiotic codes. And the Inca seem to have done this according to the physical codes that we've seen, like the wrap sticks that I excavated. And likely there are other forms as well that archaeologists will find in the future. In the case of the Colesuyu Khipus, though, I suspect that the local codes prevailed over hegemonic Inka Khipu codes, or perhaps there were innovations on Inka Khipu codes that were brought in. And we would expect that Khipus from tightly controlled and monitored regions like Inkawasi would have replicated conventions from the Inca standards, but in regions that are not as tightly controlled like Colesuyu, perhaps there was something different going on. So what I'd like to emphasize here again is that the Inca were using semiotic tools like the wrap sticks for color conventionalization. They were training Khipu Kamayuks in Cusco at a centralized location, and many other strategies. And these strategies helped to create Khipu Kamayuks who followed a set of conventions. We saw knot direction seems to correspond with elements of Quechua numerical grammar. You have chord color, which is used to denote actions, and color patterns to denote information about a Khipu as a whole that would inform how it was read. But there are still some contexts where imperial level conventionalization was not total, like an off switch. I know that this is a bit of an academic cliche at this point, but I think this is worth saying. Conventionalization was a process for the Inca, not just kind of a static thing. It was something that needed to constantly be reinforced with on-the-ground measures like these wrapped sticks and direct imperial oversight. Even with these measures, certain areas still were doing their own thing and working outside of the conventions of the state. As a result, I think meaning and the stability of the Inka Khipu system were heavily dependent on the Inca state and its own political maneuvering. Something to keep in mind, I think, for all conventionalized systems. Exactly where are the power dynamics that are keeping this thing conventionalized? In what situations do they apply? I think these are valid questions to be thinking about. So in broad terms, the takeaways that I hope you come away with is that the Khipu system was highly conventionalized in areas that were under direct Inca imperial control. That being said, the conventions were quite a bit more fluid around the edges of Inca power, such as these unofficial indigenous contexts like at Armatambo, or the hands-off strategies that the Inca Empire pursued in Colesuyu. So with that, I'll stop talking and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. And actually, I don't see questions in the question and answer or the chat at this very moment. So do anybody from the other panelists want to ask a question right now?
Yeah, Andrew, maybe I can maybe I can put forward a question. First, John, thank you so much for such a fantastic presentation. Is it feasible, I mean, given the issue of coding that you address, that quipus were also made not only as a technology of the state?
Yeah, so that's definitely possible. We know that in later eras, quipus were definitely a local technology, and especially after Spanish conquest, they were used a lot of times as a religious device that would have recorded the sins of people, and they used them as patrimonial devices in ceremonies that they would bring out and display. So it's certainly possible that quipus played that role. In the case of the Inka quipus that I've recorded and that others have recorded, these seem to be fairly standardized, though. They seem to be of the sort that we would call Inca style quipus, that are explicitly using numerical values in the way of the Inca, which was a pretty recent invention that only the Inca seem to have used up until that point. And so for these quipus in particular, I think these are likely state devices. But later on, there was definitely a lot of innovations in how they were used.
Perhaps added to that question is another one. Do you think that, for instance, other features of the quipus, for instance, their overall structure, like the number of chords, the length of the chords, could be related to the time dimension? That is it feasible that some quipus accrue more information through time? And also perhaps another dimension would be quipus that were associated with larger, in the hierarchy, higher administrative centers that would be bigger, and smaller quipus going down the hierarchy. Do you see those kinds of relationships?
Yes. So in like more local administrative sites, you definitely, you see banded quipus. These are the lower level quipus that are recording smaller numbers. The quipus themselves tend to be a little bit smaller. But actually, interestingly enough, the chords themselves, the length is remarkably consistent. So it seems like that at least is standardized and the structure is standardized. But the numerical values can vary a bit. That being said, I have found quipus at Inkawasi that are quite a bit smaller, and they seem to have just been kind of scratch paper kind of quipus that were quickly recording numerical values, but weren't meant to be the final product.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the total number of secondary chords, is there much variation? Could you give us an idea of which quipu has the largest number of secondary chords and tertiary, quaternary chords versus the smallest, the other end of the spectrum?
Yeah, so the most complicated quipus are in the very north and the very south. You have especially complicated colors and subsidiaries and all of the like in the Chachapoyas region of northern Peru, and those are exceptionally complex. You also find those in Chile, the region that I was talking about, where you have 7th and 8th order subsidiaries. And it gets very complicated very fast to try to figure out what exactly is going on with those.
But then I assume that I mean, it's striking because one would assume that at Cusco, you would have the most complicated quipus, given the centrality of the capital. But then I assume that it is because you are not expecting to find archaeologically, quipus in the highlands. Is that the case?
Yeah, unfortunately, the only quipus that we can find archaeologically are on the coast, in the desert.
Mm-hmm.
Anything in the highlands is gone. If it was an archaeological quipu, the only ones that might have survived are ones that were looted at some point and somehow made it to a European museum. But we don't know where they're from a lot of times. So I have no idea in terms of the geography of where exactly they're from. But yeah, that's a major issue. The taphonomy is pretty tricky with quipus. You can really only get north-south kinds of relations. You can't get the highlands versus lowlands. But yeah, you would certainly expect the regional centers up in the highlands to have been the most complicated.
Thank you.
So we have some questions on the question that I want to get in here. One question is actually what type of fiber was used for the quipu? And then I would add is that conventionalized or not? Or does that show regional variation? And we have another question, which is how were the quipu stored to ensure preservation for long term? I'll start with those two questions.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm actually working on a paper on the fibers right now. One of the issues is that researchers haven't effectively recorded fibers. So I'm re-recording many of them. But from what I can tell, you have most of the quipus are made from cotton fiber. There are sometimes llama wool, alpaca wool fiber that's mixed into the cotton fiber, and that seems to have been significant actually. And there are sometimes entirely alpaca wool fiber cords as well. There's one quipu that is made entirely of human hair. There are a number of quipus as well that have individual cords that are this kind of vegetal bast fiber, which just looks kind of like a grass that has been made into a cord. From my initial studies of just a couple of these quipus in museums in the US, it seems like they also followed a marked, unmarked sort of pattern, but this is not statistically significant. This is 10 quipus. It seems like at least in those quipus, though, the cotton fiber cords were used to represent kind of individual level recordings. And the woolen cords were used to represent like summary statistics and totals. So you might have the numbers 1, 2, 3 recorded on cotton, and then you would have the number 6 recorded on wool. So it would have been used to designate the difference between those. But these are very administrative quipus and from just a couple museums around the US. So that definitely is preliminary. In terms of the storage, we don't know a lot of times, but the excavated quipus are generally either found in giant clay vases. So especially when they're stored in funerary contexts, they're in these giant vases next to the body. You also have at Inkawasi, where they're actually actively being used in a storehouse context, you find them in these little boxes. They're kind of woven boxes, and inside the box, they'll have a quipu that's all bundled up. It's just in a cute little form that looks like a burrito. Inside there as well, you'll find these little packages of the wrap sticks and the extra cords and the fiber and all that kind of stuff. So in general, we don't know, but in the few contexts that we've actually been able to get good proveniences, that's generally how they're stored.
Okay. And then there was a third question, which I apologize if I missed. I was reading questions at the same time you were responding to Javier, but the question was building off Javier's question. The person was curious about the highest magnitude quipus that have been recorded, and what would we learn from that kind of a number? And then I'll ask that one, and there's another one in the chat, another one in the questions, but I'll let you go.
Yeah, so the biggest numbers on the quipus, I can't remember offhand which quipu exactly has the biggest number, but I do know that the numbers go up into the hundreds of thousands, and the biggest numbers that I think the biggest numbers that we see are from this site of Pachacamac, which was kind of a pilgrimage site where people from all over the Inca Empire would go, and they would leave offerings. And one of the things they would do is they would leave their quipu at the site. So it has one of the broadest samples in a loose sense of quipus anywhere at the site of Pachacamac, because you have people coming from all over the place and leaving their quipus along with their donations to the site. So I believe the biggest one is there. So we don't know the exact location that it was from, but it was in Pachacamac, which is on the coast near Lima.
And then a question from Gerardo, which I don't think people could see if you don't have access to the chat. For the rest of the audience, what is your opinion of the possible quipus reported in Caral? And what do you think about the mathematical content of the ethnographic quipus reported by Frank Salomon?
Yeah, so the Caral quipus are very controversial. And I think most quipu scholars fall on the side that they're not really quipus. They look a bit like quipus, but there are a lot of knot and cord technologies in the Andes that are attached to like weaving and all the like, and they don't seem to have any of the features that we would expect a quipu to have, especially given the fact that later we find Wari quipus and pre-Wari quipus that are doing something pretty different from what those are doing. What was the second question?
Sorry, the mathematical content of the ethnographic quipus reported by Frank Salomon. What do you think of that?
I don't know. Could you explain a little bit about what you'd like me to comment on?
Gerardo.
So you remember that Frank Salomon kind of reported a large collection of quipus ethnographically very close to Lima in one of the highland villages. And so actually they are used in all the rituals for the village. They are worn as part of the attire of the officials of that village. But they do have kind of mathematical content, but I don't know if you have seen them and could like give us an opinion on those late kind of colonial surviving quipus.
Yeah, so the Tupicocha quipus, yeah, they're actually banded quipus. It seems like they would have operated in a similar way to the ones that Highland was looking at. So Highland actually looked at the one she was looking at in inspiration from Frank, and from what I can tell, those seem like standard labor accounting quipus. They might have been late, but they seem to basically have the same kinds of strategies for enumeration and for recording information as like a classic Inca banded quipu. that being said, we also have quipus like that from the Santa Valley in the 17th century. So probably we're talking like at least 1700 into the present day, but they seem like pretty standard labor accounting quipus.
One final question just from the question and answers. And I'll add myself, I was fascinated to learn that some of these quipus are still being used actively in the present, which I was not aware of. So how much guidance can we really get from the present usages? How broad are they? And are they, how much evidence is that they're highly continuous with past usages going back for several hundred years?
Yeah, so I'll flag Carol Mackey's 1970 dissertation on quipus. She actually did an analysis of how quipus from the administrative side of Puruchuco relate to contemporary at the time herding quipus. So she does an in-depth analysis if you're interested in learning more on that. And of course, Frank Solomon and others have written later. But I think there's quite a bit of value in looking at these modern quipus just for ideas. I think a lot of times the signs that they use are slightly different, and often come up with hypotheses for what you should expect to see in the Inca quipus, given what they're doing in the contemporary ones. Even in the Quechua language, I've taken a number of Quechua classes in Cusco, and just learning the Quechua language, you can come to understand how things are structured, and I think get a much better sense of what was potentially going on in order to form good questions for the Inca quipus. So I think it's essential. I work regularly with Sabine Hyland's work, and Manny Medrano is now working with her as well, who has done some of this work. And I think it's essential that the post-conquest modern stuff and the Inca people work together, because it's much more similar, I think, than people recognize.
Is there time for another question, or are we?
As far as I'm concerned, unless Joe stops me.
No, go ahead. I mean, we're at our lunch break, but as long as people are satisfied with however long the break will be, let's keep going. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I just wanted to, thank you for an interesting talk. And I wonder, in terms of the chronology of their development, if I understand you correctly, then there's a consolidation of the conventions during the Incan Empire. But what, do you have enough of a picture of the chronological development of the system before that to see changes, to see, I guess, the difference before and after that systemization, or am I just misunderstanding it, and that they really didn't exist in the form that we think of quipus until the Incan Empire, and that was an innovation of the Inca state? Yeah, so as far as the evidence is concerned right now, we think that the Inca quipu is probably the most conventionalized of the systems. There were a series of wari quipus beforehand. So this is like middle horizon 500 to 1,000, more or less. These quipus are very similar. They do a lot of things that are very similar to Inca quipus, but they're also quite a bit different structurally. So they wrap colors around cords, and they have different knots. The knots are base 5 as opposed to base 10. There are all sorts of differences, and I suspect that the Inca system was a later innovation off of that. Maybe it was around the wari were in around the same area. And it's possible that the Inca were just the most widespread conventionalized system based off of that. But
the evidence is just too sparse, I think, to get much of an evolutionary chronology. Really, all we know is that at one point in around 500 to 1,000, you get these weird-looking wari quipus that have numbers on them that we can read, have a ton of colors on them. And then somewhere around, let's say 1200, 1300, you start to see Inka Khipus, which gradually are kind of chopped off at Spanish conquest and turned into all sorts of subversive forms of communication because the Spanish started burning them and doing all of that. Yeah, so as a result, after that, they just kind of went off and all the conventions became different things. But yeah,
so there's no
I
like
don't think
smoking
really
gun of a location like in Cusco. They had this kind of quipu beforehand, and then that became the dominant convention.
Yeah, unfortunately, not really.
And then just one follow-up question on that. With the you had mentioned the knotted systems for weaving, and is there any kind of, maybe the evidence doesn't exist for this either, but a connection between the wari ones and these earlier textile technologies, I guess you could say, that would give us an understanding? So if the Corral ones are controversial, are they controversial because they aren't quipu as we define them currently, or are they simply not part of that lineage of knot development? And I guess that's kind of interest,
so
because when I hear people talk about it, it seems like there's these very defined categories, but maybe there's a broader connection. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, the location that I would direct you is Jeff Splitstoser has written great work on Paracas, which is another early area. And there's an enormous weaving tradition there alongside a wrapped stick tradition, much like what I found in the Inca tradition. And these wrapped sticks have cords attached to them that seem to be much more like quipus than what you see in Corral. So I think most people are of the opinion that that's a better case for an early quipu progenitor, and seems to be well within line of what we see in later traditions. So I'd encourage you to read Jeff Splitstoser's work in Paracas.